Right, let's start again then. Hi, Greg. Really good for you to join us. I won't try and introduce you. I'll leave that to you. So if you could give us an introduction to who you are and what you're doing, and we'll go from there, please.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Greg Glass, whiskey maker and blender for White Mackay. So I joined White Mackay coming on 5 years to work directly with Richard Patterson on across all of our distilleries, as well as working alongside him with the Dalmore as well.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that always interests me, obviously, we do know Richard Patterson. He's known world over, and I think the first time I heard about you was from the Whiskey Works, which we knew was a subsidiary of White Mackay. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Whiskey Works and then move back into White Mackay itself then?
Yeah, certainly. So Whiskey Works, really, it was the week that I came into the business that I'd sort of suggested it would be great to create a sort of innovation wing within White Mackay that could look at looking at how we can both share some of the wonderful whiskies and casks that we have in our warehousing, but also to have a play about with different innovations and flavor experiences. So really, for me, Whiskey Works is really a vehicle to share some cracking whiskies with people. First and foremost, it's flavor led as a brand. And looking at some classical style whiskies, but also looking at some different practices and innovations as well. We're fairly new. We're still not really out there that much, but it's sort of building the name of Whiskey Works, for whiskey fans,
Yeah, and as Kieran sort of mentioned to us earlier, obviously, like I say, I know you're more for the Whiskey Works side of it, but obviously you are now looking after Fettercairn. So can you give us a little bit of an insight into how you approach each day as a blender, and what your job is for for the difference in working with Whiskey Works compared to working with Fettercairn and individual distilleries?
So there's more similarities than differences, but I think when you've got a distillery like Fettercairn, we have close to 200 years of history there and stocks that are really going way, way back. And really from the point of view of the practice of blending and the philosophy of blending, there's really very little difference in what you're trying to achieve. I think when you've got a brand like Fettercairn, you're looking at retaining the beauty that's produced at the distillery, and also the future potential of going off in slightly different angles. With Whiskey Works, it almost feeds more into an independent bottler style approach to things, where we're using different distilleries, different styles of casks, whether they're within the White Mackay portfolio, but more often than not, in actual fact, outside of that. So our first sets of releases, in actual fact, there's only one of our distilleries that's made a part of one of the recipes. So there's the flexibility, the freedom to go outside of just that, that single distillery. But what's beautiful about single malts and in general is the beauty and charm, as you guys will know, of the uniqueness that you'll get from each individual set of casks. And also historically, what I love doing is going through the old ledgers, looking at the different cask styles, the fermentation times, the yeast types, the barley types, and that then gives us different avenues and angles to go into in flavor, but also in sharing some of the sort of experimentation and trialing that we've done. So Fettercairn is wonderful. It's always been really a hidden gem within the White Mackay portfolio, but I'm sure Kieran's probably mentioned, it's all dunnage warehousing. We're doing a lot of trialing and experimentation within those warehouses with cask types, as well as going right the way back to some of the distillation experimentation that's gone on in the years, and also upcoming as well.
I mean, one thing for me is when we think about whiskey blenders, we just think it's a perfect world. You come in the office, you've got 50, 60, 100 samples in front of you. You have a swig out of all these whiskies. Just how different is a working day than drinking alcohol all day, basically?
Well, I mean, it's a different approach. I mean, you almost feel a little bit schizophrenic sometimes because you're working across lots of different brands, not just within your own house, but also outside of that as a blender, as you know, with cask trading and the like. But the approach is very different. So, for example, today, Kieran, when you arrived in, I was doing some filtration trials for a non-Scotch product, in actual fact, and then away through to my office looking at single cask selection for an upcoming Jura that Graham Logan and I are working on, and then I'm back into a Feta Cairn, in actual fact, that I've just been looking at. So the real spread of what you're looking at, but also here in our sample room, this is also where we're doing all the approval work as well. So coming into the office, I like to compartmentalize the day as much as possible and focus on each individual distillery and give it the proper time for that. But when we're looking at prototyping and following up on liquid development, it's really just ensuring that you're giving the dedication and time for assessment work. I think that's really important when you've got so many different projects on the go. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here on a Sunday. So and not terribly dressed up for the occasion.
No, I think when it's a Sunday and these times, there's no point dressing to the nines. But one thing that does intrigue me as somebody getting a chance to talk to somebody who's a blender, how do you try to stick to tasting whiskies in the morning then, like we're all led to believe? And do you how do you cleanse your palate, and how do you sort of take a break from maybe designing one whiskey to go into another whiskey and getting it into your head, the differences that you're looking for?
Yeah, so the classical thing is doing your assessment in the morning. Now we're getting in samples usually every day, and that's usually mid-morning. So then setting that up for doing approvals as well. But really, as long as you're managing your palate and your day quite carefully, you shouldn't really have too many issues if you sort of phase and stagger out what you're doing during the day. I mean, I have things like it's quite a classical technique, but with roasted coffee is a good way of just sort of cleansing your organoleptics, and plenty of water, ensuring you're hydrated is really important, especially if you're doing this sort of assessment in an air-conditioned environment. You have to be really careful that you're maintaining your hydration, because that's obviously extremely important from a nosing point of view, but also tasting. So with its product development, I try and do that in different environments. So in here, we have more of a, if you like, an analytical environment that's quite constant. Through my office, I've got a separate area, which is an old 1950s architect's drafting board. And I use that for my more creative tasting notes and stuff. And then I'll take samples home and try that in the environment that people who drink our whiskies will. And that's where I'll then accumulate tasting notes over time. So I feel it's really important that you're evaluating your whiskies, not just in a clinical lab environment, but out there in the real world as well.
Yep. I mean, Vim's just asked a question. I'm assuming he generally doesn't talk. So is there a defined outcome to your blending?
Yeah, yes, but not always. So I know I like typically is my favorite word, because really in reality, when you're a blender, you're looking at an end goal, and that can be something that's with pinpoint accuracy that you're trying to achieve. But often what I like to do is sort of semi-aim for that, but give it a little bit of room to breathe and move in its own direction. As you guys will know, 9 times out of 10, intuition really helps you out when you're starting off on a project, and as you get closer and closer, you're refining it in, and you're looking at analytics, you're looking at science, but largely it's about getting the right feel for that end product. So that inspiration can come from different environments. You can look at almost like a commercial brief. So this is what we'd like to do for this particular market, and here's some parameters. Here's what the serve is going to be. And then leave it over to you guys to then develop something that fits that brief. But also, we're end-to-end whiskey makers. Particularly Richard and I have a philosophy of hands-on, flavor-led whiskey making, and that's about following a product development in all different areas throughout its entire life. So we're heavily involved in the branding side of a lot of our whiskies as well, thinking about the naming of our whiskies, and we're in constant contact with all of our departments across whiskey development. So particularly our brand teams, our marketing and commercial teams, it's really important to have that mentality of working together to try and get to a great outcome. I mean, one whiskey, for example, that was one of the early ones that I developed was called the Woodsman, which is a grain and malt blend. And what we were looking at is what could go as well as the strict whiskey outcome. We're also looking at that as being a great whiskey for mixing. So what styles of mixers could go with it, and that was a fascinating project that Richard and I worked on, because we were in here trying out lots of different serves, your cola products and various other things. Now a lot of you might go, well, Richard in here with a lot of ice and cola, but you know what, it's some of the best recipe development that we've ever done, which is pinpointing it down to that particular serve.
And while we're talking about Whiskey Works, Fee had a question for you.
Yep, so I had to find the button and then lean forward. Do you have any new releases coming out, please?
For the
so we have, we're working on it currently, but we've got a couple of very exciting whiskies. One which is actually going to be a return to utilising Scottish oak in the recipe. Can't say too much about it right now, but it's that's going to be an exciting one. King of Trees. I don't know if you guys spoke a little bit about King of Trees. So the use of the 2 Windfell oak trees in the single cask that we made up a proportion of the recipe rather than 100%. And so I used that Scottish oak to add layers of sort of sweet cinnamon spice to the original fresh fruity sort of orchard fruit characteristics. This upcoming release will have a lot more sort of Scottish oak influence to it, which is really exciting. The Scottish oak program, I don't know if you guys talked a little bit about.
No, I thought I ought to leave that in case you're coming in.
So. All right, okay, yeah. Sorry. So for those of you who might not be aware, I mean, it's one of these things that I've been developing sort of in the background in the industry, has been a Scottish oak cask making program. So as you'll know, within Scotch whisky, Scottish oak is not really utilised. In the past, there's been sort of one-offs here or there, but what I've been developing sort of from inspiration in terms of how I wanted to do it about 15 years ago, and really in earnest over the past 10 years, I've been working with foresters, landowners, cooperages, all around Scotland to see how we could maybe build a programme of Scottish oak cask making. So the received wisdom, and there's a lot of reason for it, is that there's not enough oak in Scotland. It's not for managed forests, therefore you don't get a good yield from your oak tree to your usable oak for cask making. So that's one big part of it, and therefore it would be a lot more expensive. But also that the skills in Scotland in terms of coopering, many years ago, there used to be a lot more cask making from oak and from individual staves. So there wasn't necessarily the ability to upscale any Scottish oak utilisation for casks. So what we've done is we've also partnered up with Speyside Cooperage and created a training program within their apprenticeship scheme to train coopers how to build casks from scratch. So as part of this holistic Scottish cask making program is building in the cooper training aspect, also responsible sourcing, so ensuring that the oak trees are either wind fell, so they've come down by nature after 200 or 300 years, or there's a management program from where those trees have come from to ensure replanting. And so typically it's around about 3 trees per one that's taken out of a system. The other aspect of the program was speaking, and working with sawmills, particularly a group called ASHES, or the Association of Scottish Hardwood Sawmillers, was that many sawmills in Scotland were closing down. Not only that, but a lot of their oak was being exported outside of Scotland for secondary processing. So just right there from working on the ground with sawmills, I could see that maybe this was an opportunity also for the Scottish sawmill industry, hardwood sawmill industry in particular, not to maybe keep some of them afloat, but also just to help promote the local economy. So again, we've got partnerships with sawmill industry, but also in terms of planting, replanting. That's an integral part of what I wanted to build into the program. So we have both dedicated forests for managing forests and planting oak forests for whiskey grade oak in the future in Scotland, a little bit like what they started doing in France 200-300 years ago, way ahead of us. So what we're looking at is how do we actuate that, even at a small scale, to start building for the industry in the future. So an element of planting dedicated oak trees for the future, but also an element of rewilding. So we work with Trees for Life as well. So there's an element of replanting for rewilding as well. So it's quite a holistic Scottish oak program. But what we wanted to do was build it up so that it would be for the benefit of the entire industry. So that's why in my development of the program was bringing in Speyside Cooperage, because that was really the best way to be able to actuate it for other customers, so that we could share information about the best sawmills to use, the sourcing of the oak. So this program is not just for Whiskey Works or White Mackay. The whole intention is to benefit the industry for those who would like to responsibly source Scottish oak.
Mm. I think Gary's got a sort of question for you now. So do you want to go, Gary?
Yeah. Hey, Greg, how you doing?
Yeah.
Greg, fairly safe to say, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here to say you've got a reputation for pushing the boundaries. And I'm just wondering how you're finding balancing that with working across the various distilleries and kind of keeping the distillery style and the distillery character there, or as I suppose to an extent Whiskey Works lets you go off and do your kind of more weird and wonderful stuff.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I'm just one of many people who are before me and before Richard as well, who are pushing the boundaries. Everyone has pushed the boundaries to a certain extent, and it's what I call a sort of continual tradition of innovation. And it's really about, I think, passing on to the people who come after us something that is maybe slightly different from how we received it, but without changing the real DNA of it. I mean, Richard and I have had a fantastic, close to a half-hour chat just dedicated on an old distillery manager called Drew Sinclair at Dalmore Distillery, and there's a bit of crossover when I worked there for a short period of time and Richard's sort of working relationship. And we were talking about the innovations that he was doing up until the sort of 2006 time, 2005, 2006, when he'd retired. And what's lovely is it's picking up all those legacies of what each of these individual people have done that changes things. You look at Fettercairn, up until 1952, there wasn't this cooling ring that was there. So, you talk about 200 years, but then you look at something that's relatively recently with that. I think it's really about, being a, custodian has a lot of different connotations to it, but part of being a custodian is also moving with the times as well and embracing new technologies and ways of doing things. But stylistically, as long as the heart and soul doesn't change within one generation, I feel that's a hope that I can pass on to the next sets of blenders and whiskey makers here, with a couple of tweaks, possibly.
Yep. Go on, Andy.
Hey, mate. Hi, Greg. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on, mate. Really interesting so far. My question's really around whether you have a particular distillery in the portfolio that you keep going back to. It's kind of something that speaks out to you a little bit when it comes to sort of producing the blended side of the business. I mean, Jura, I'll be honest, isn't a whiskey that I drink too much of. However, when I have tried it in sort of a more natural format, a single cask or something, it's a lovely fruity, chunky spirit, which personally I think would probably work quite well in blended. I know you've obviously involved in Fettercairn quite heavily, as Kieran alluded to, but is there another distillery that you keep going back to as sort of like a base for a lot of your creations?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dalmore, that's my local distillery. So I grew up right next to Dalmore, and I worked there actually for a short period prior to moving on to. I did various things, but I also worked at Compass Box for just over 11 years as well. But then moved back to Scotland and started working with Richard. So Dalmore has a real close association. That's my local distillery essentially, but all of them are just so unique, and the spirit style is so different, and the personalities that are there are fantastic. So we're working across all of these distilleries, but really giving them their own respect for what they are in their own individual right. I would say, Dalmore again is my local one, so I've got a real sort of my heartstrings sort of pull whenever we talk about Dalmore and the uniqueness within the whiskey industry. Fettercairn, wonderful as well. I spend a lot of time at Fettercairn in terms of in the warehousing with Stuart Walker and the brewer Bruce as well. So we spend a lot of time in there assessing casks together, and beautiful, unique distillery. So really, I'm not answering the question, am I? Because they're all just so lovely, and to some extent, I fall in love with the distilleries every time I nose a cask. So if I'm nosing through sets of casks, and there's one that jumps out, that's then automatically my favourite one. One of the ones that's not mentioned much is Invergordon, our single grain distillery. I love old grain whiskies, and really I got introduced to grain whiskey a little bit in my early days, but particularly when I worked with John Glazer at Compass Box with Hedonism, which was one of the grain whiskies there. I had a lot of experience, and I came, even in those days, came across some really beautiful old Invergordon casks. So coming into White Mackay, it was one that I really wanted to get up into the warehousing, some of the old stuff, the stuff from 30, 40-year-old grain whiskies. Now, it's it's not too difficult to find your expressions of old grain whiskies, but ones that really have a compellingness to them, something that's different and unique and can stand up against your malts, as it were. It's sometimes a little bit tricky. So Invergordon as well is fantastic. That's also where we do a lot of our aging as well up there, and we've got some of our blending operations. So that's a beautiful one. I actually brought here, and we are definitely 2 meters away. So
What's that?
yeah. So well, this is one that I just fell in love with. That so this one is a Fettercairn project. Sorry, there's not smell-o-vision here.
It's not for you.
I'm going to say we're just trying to look at Kieran's face, but we can't quite see him. So yeah, he's smiling, so it can't be that bad.
Yeah, so
It's not that.
does it smell a little bit like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Really? Big reveal.
Can't quite see. You might have to explain. Juicy fruit, chewing gum.
So I'm actually sending this down to, it's a sample of Fettercairn that we're looking at. So sending it down to Stuart Walker or up to Stuart Walker and Bruce, because what we like to do is we like to talk about, what does it bring back memories of? And I know most blenders speak about this, going back to some of their favorite flavors from childhood. But it's one of the things that I tend to look at each of the individual distilleries is not just about that signature style, but also what it brings me back to. So Jura, for example, the new make spirit brings me back to key lime pie or lemon meringue pie. You get this lovely citrusy freshness to it. Richard and I talk a lot about the Dalmore having the sort of chocolate orange and robustness and sort of old school Highland malt characteristics. And you certainly get that. And I know there's a lot of debate about sort of terroir because it's obviously dependent on a multiple of variables that are within the process. But for us, you really do get that signature characteristic that brings you back to aromas and flavors and characters. So as a whiskey maker, for me, it's also about balancing, that history of the distilleries, but also retaining that core characters for the future.
I mean, one thing I wanted to sort of talk about, as soon as we got the opportunity, as a blender, we often hear that when you're analysing whiskies and tasting to put whiskies together, you water them down to maybe 20% ABV. Is this something you do? And can you explain as to why you actually do that?
Yeah, so if it's purely for approval and assessment work, the industry standard is 20%. That's how everyone in the industry is trained for that purpose. So as blenders, we and whiskey makers, we also do it at that level. But particularly for product development, we only do that really at the last step, because that's for maintaining the quality and the sort of quality control aspects. I don't know if you did a little share around of the sample room in here.
I did, yeah.
But you might have seen some about 50 different samples around here. So these are our vatting samples and bottling samples that we've come through for our final approval. And so what we do with these ones is we look at them at bottling strength or natural strength. If it's high ABV, what I personally like to do is take it down approximately bottling strength of what that final liquid will be, or 40% just straight away, and then down to 20% as well to delve further into it. And largely the reason there is so you don't get nose blindness when you're sampling a number of these. So I mean, we're looking at on an average day, we'll probably get about 20 to 30 samples in here, but sometimes we can get a load in. I think Wednesday next week, we're probably going to have about 500 samples that come in that we're looking to assess, which is a mix of new make spirit evaluations and approvals, but also mature stock as well. Certainly the new make, the grain new makes, we definitely take down quite a bit before we stick our noses into that.
Yeah, and so with that then, does it often happen where if you've analysed something at 20%, it just doesn't work at 40 or above? And same the opposite way, when it works at 40 or 50%, it just doesn't work at 20%?
Well, largely the 20%, the purpose of that is to look for any off notes when you're in a more of a lab environment, as it were, for quality control. So what you're doing is you're assessing it against a control, and there's different methods that you'll do that sort of assessment with. But largely, it's to allow you to be able to assess more samples within there, and also get to maintain a level where you can pick out some of these different elements there. But when it comes to product development in terms of recipe iterations and prototyping of something that's brand new, you have to take it for what it is. So only until we start looking to produce things like spider charts for our nosing panels will we take it to 20%, so that we're doing it at the same level as what they would do, which is for the approval side of it. So in terms of a nosing panel, we have fantastic nosing panel teams, both at Grangemouth, which is where we bottle most of our whiskies. Also, we have Invergordon, where we're doing some of the pre-blending and recasking operations there. So it's really important. That's our first line of defense in the quality side of things, is they're looking at this 20% level. But on occasion, we will ask them to look at the samples, and from a tasting point of view, that's not typical, but on occasion, we give people the opportunity on a voluntary basis to take samples home, and then they can feed back to us some of their thoughts on some of these liquids. But generally the 20%, because it's purely on nosing, and that's the industry standard, is the reason we do that. Rarely would we ever say that how it's perceived at 20% should determine what the recipe is. It's more about the ideal bottling strength. And that's one of the other things that we do promote, is any time that you see an alcohol level on the bottle, that's been well thought through. That's been thought through by Richard and I and the rest of the team on what's the ideal delivery of flavour for that liquid. And it will change. It will also depend on what market it's going to as well, which will determine that ABV point.
And so when you're doing your blending, say, for argument's sake, in the room where you're in, do you find that the atmosphere changes the fact that you've brought different samples in every day, or is it a pretty clean environment anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clean and clear. We're actually doing a little bit of a rejig of the sample room right now. But yeah, what we try and do is keep it clean and clear as possible. So it's a bit unusual, because today I've been going through a lot of these samples, but having watch glasses will help that. But we also have a air purifier that we have in here, which we put on regularly in and out of samples. So we try and keep it as clean and clear as we possibly can. That's extremely important. Going back to what I was talking about environment, but it's also important to try your whiskey that you've developed outside of your own environment, and try it out in the real world. I think that's critical to anything that's new, and whether that be something that's could be seen as more of a mainstream versus a limited release, that doesn't matter. You have to really understand the product in the different environments that it's assessed.
Yeah. I think Gary had another question if he's ready to come back in. Yeah. Has he gone?
Hey, Greg. Thinking specifically about Jura and coming on to... No, it's still here.
Yeah, go on.
Hello?
Hello?
Right, okay. Specifically,
Hello?
and I imagine
Can you hear us?
you will probably guess this one a lot, Greg.
Hello, Gary?
Yeah?
Hello? Go on, sorry.
You're an absolute wido. So yeah, Greg, and specifically on Sevenwood, where do you even start with something like that when you're looking at something that's got so many components? Did you start with, say, 10 different cast finishes and whittle it from there, or was there a clear idea from the start?
Yeah, so Sevenwood was a really interesting one. So when I came into the business, coming coming on for 5 years, there had already been the stocks laid down there. So Richard had laid these stocks down as an experiment, well, about 4 or 5 years prior to that, as a finished liquid rather than a full maturation. So in the stages of doing the development of 7-wood, it was building from a much larger pool of cask types from France, and then we sort of narrowed it down. It was a building up of the recipe rather than a building down, as it were. So starting with the key distinctive characters that we felt would be right for the house style as well, and to keep it quite vibrant and allow the wood to shine through. So it was a build up of the recipe. So it started really with 3, and then we started adding on other layers to it, and it built up to the 7 by the end of the process. But really, the key ones that we have there are the Vosges oak, which gives a sort of slightly chocolatey character to it. We've got Limousin and Bertrange, which gives like peachy qualities. So each of the different oak components in the sourcing do give quite distinctive different characteristics to it, but there's really 2 to 3 that have the core the core characteristics. It's quite a tricky one to maintain the consistency of, because we're using these different French oak types. It's also a mix of, there'll be an element of virgin French oak as well as second use, which will have previously had Jura in it. So it's really about stock management of the qualities that we have there with that. But you know, it's not a massive volume that we produce of 7-wood, but it sort of tickles people about the sort of nuances behind the oak types that we have. We have very good working relationships out in France, you know, on the oak procurement side of things. So we work with partners like Demptos out there, and we can utilize some of the research that they do in different areas and different levels via, for example, the University of Bordeaux. They do quite a lot of analytical research on the properties of each of these individual oaks over time, and how that changes over time as well.
Mm. And jumping back into the
Greg, so Greg, was it a oh, sorry, son.
No, sorry, you go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say, so did you start off with the 7-wood? Did you have an idea of a flavour profile that you wanted to get to at the end? Because you say you obviously started off with, or you kind of started off with a core of 3 but worked up to 7. Like, what was the end goal that you guys had in mind for that?
The end goal was to really highlight the properties of the French oaks, which was really determined by what had been laid down. So it's sort of determined by the stocks, and when we were assessing all these different oak types, it was just really, some of them were coming through as having this lovely freshness and balance. When you're full virgin oak, as you guys will know, you can often get a lot of harsh tannins, and it's a bit overbearing. So really what we wanted to do was sort of fine tune it. That's why one of the components, so 7 are the 7 woods, one of the 7 is American oak, and that just allows us to balance that out, and that's ex-bourbon, to allow for balancing the stronger elements that were there. But what was compelling in looking at the individual French oaks was that really spoke to us about which characters that we wanted. So really the final bottling is much more about the freshness, like tropical fruit characteristics, peaches, spiced peaches. We wanted something that had that nuance to it. So it's one of the ones that's actually the lightest and freshest out of the core Juras that we make, and that was purposeful to get that balance, that sort of harmony. We could have gone all out and done it super heavy on the new oaks that were within the recipe, but that would have kicked out the balance of the distillery character, which we really wanted to maintain. From a perception of flavour, it's one of the ones that's on that lighter side in terms of the phenolics, peat phenolics, out of the range, so it allows the wood to sing there.
I'm guessing Gary's finished now, his camera's gone off. So what I wanted to just ask was sort of jumping back and talking about Invergordon and grain whisky in particular. Do you have to approach your technique, do you have to change your techniques with the approach to working with grain whiskies compared to single malts then?
From a quality point of view and a philosophy, no. You know, if it's a great, I break it down into flavors, if you like. So in that, to answer that, yes, I do, because they tend to have a certain set of flavors, and it's the purpose it's being used for. But increasingly, you know, looking at grain releases and premium blends in which we're, you know, highly focused on that quality of the grain, you are looking for that balance. So, I mean, there's some almost simplistic ways you can view grain whiskey, but if you're looking at the age sector of grain whiskey, it can be as rich and deep and complex as malt whiskies, and arguably sometimes even more so, depending on the style. So for me, it's about that output of what the flavor is that's going to be compelling to people. And sometimes, you know, I've developed liquids that start off as being single malts, they then end up being blended malts, and then they ended up being a grain and blend malt because that's what's suited it best, you know, for that. And it's and that's where there's not maybe a specific requirement for it to be a particular category, but often you'll develop a blended malt and you'll think, this is great because we can put malt on the label, it's going to sell. Yeah, you know, it's going to sell more, but in actual fact, for the recipe, it's way better if we add that in. We came out with Whiskey Works Quartermaster, which was a grain and malt blend, and that one we were utilising rum casks that had actually filled with Invergordon, and these rum casks had a way in a corner up in one of the warehouses at Invergordon, and I hadn't contemplated using it within this recipe. The idea was to bring different finishing types to a heavy malt style, but then adding this in changed my mind completely about what we'd release there, and it actually benefited the recipe partly because of this rum finished Invergordon grain that was there.
I mean, one thing that I think's changing in people's minds these days is we always associated grain whiskey with basically going into pour crab casks because it was always meant for blending and things like that. Whereas obviously now we're starting to look at putting grain whiskies out there, and we're obviously seeing a lot of older grain whiskies, but is the philosophy now with these grain whiskies to try and bring them into the market as a younger, putting them into better casks and giving you a better way of working with them?
Yeah, and within the making of our blends as well, it's really important to treat the grain whiskey with respect. You know, it's a central heart of any grain and malt recipe will be that, and that might not mean it's the majority of the recipe, but from a flavor profile, every cask and every grade of cask has to be the best you can possibly do. So with the opportunities with grain whiskey in the future, I think there's a lot of stuff that we're looking at the moment with younger grain. Now that, particularly now, the older grain has started to get that positive reputation within whiskey enthusiasts. You know, it's lovely, that sort of full circle approach of people starting off in the blends, going up to the malts, and then going, oh, this thing grain whiskey, or going back to blends and then going to grain whiskey, and then, you know, returning back to blended whiskies, which can be superb. You know, and it's always worth revisiting blended whiskies at all price levels and seeing the improvements that have happened over time. So yeah, I mean, grain whiskey, I think younger grain whiskey is something that's got more potential to it. If it's, you know, if it's invested in properly, which is largely down to the wood policy that's there.
Yeah.
Does that mean you could release a younger grain whiskey with more flavour potential than you would a younger malt?
With more flavour potential, yeah. Well, your input of your cask is going to be quite distinctive. So we're just about to actually fill some grain whiskey into some Scottish oak as well. It's upcoming in the coming weeks. And what's really interesting about that is you're then taking something that is maybe a lighter style and giving people that experience of fresh oak that's coming through. So it's almost like for a whiskey enthusiast point of view, that's great. You're almost starting from a base where you get that information, a little peek behind the scenes of what sort of flavors come from different woods, different casks within there. But I think what's not about is taking what could be perceived as a bland spirit, because there's a lot of variance in grain whiskey in terms of the spirit itself, but it's about pairing it right and for the right output as well. I think that's key to your previous point, is what is the output of it? It's not just about selling more young grain. For me, it's more about sharing the potential of the flavour and beauty of young grain, for me, rather than like a commercial drive to try and push it out there. I think it'd be lovely, I know there have been some brands that have come out that are on that younger side, but really for brands to come out and really shout and scream about the beauty that can be there with grain, and as you guys know, historically, all the arguments and debates, is grain whiskey a Scotch whiskey at all? Is it a whiskey? All that stuff. I mean, I love that. Let's prove the point that it is with Scotch whiskey. It is Scotch whiskey, but really we can share it at a younger age in something beautiful. But that's where the benefit of also blending can be seen in, is the wood policy that's generally done for single malts can then help to feed in some of that weight, if you like, into the recipes.
Looking at the messages, Kieran's letting us know that you're about to get locked in the building. So what I'll do is I'll actually finish the recording now and say thank you very much, and try and offer to see if we can get you on again and do another session with you, if that's possible one day, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was a surprise. I was in anyway, and so
yeah.
It's,
so the 21st, genuinely, the 21st of July is the anniversary of Invergordon.
Yeah.
Good reason to get together in July.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we'll certainly set something